All right, I would like to introduce Dr. Kat Sterner. Dr. Kat Sterner grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. She went to Penn State for her undergrad and graduated from Penn State, and then she attended University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and earned her Ph.D. in 2018, right?
Yes.
She's worked in Britain, in Mexico, and throughout the Great Lakes region and the Mid-Atlantic. Her research focuses on stone tool analysis and lithic analysis, essentially. Kat has extensive experience in cultural resource management and contract archaeology. Prior to entering academia, she's in her first year of a tenure track position at Towson University. So she's a new assistant professor, learning how to be a professor in the middle of the pandemic. Your timing is just impeccable here. It gets better. Trust me, it gets better. Once it'll get better. It's a distinct pleasure to introduce a friend, a colleague, and someone whom is a co-collaborator with me on some research projects, Dr. Kat Sterner. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was very nice. Yeah, my colleagues at Towson keep telling me, they're just like, man, it must be so hard starting on the tenure track during the pandemic. I'm like, is it? I don't know. Isn't this what it's like? So, when it's all you know, you just kind of roll with it. So thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to kind of have a new forum for me to share this research and get some feedback from you guys, talk to you about this. I think that, I've given this talk in Wisconsin. I've talked about it some out here in Maryland and Pennsylvania, but I think that you guys will have some unique perspectives on this, coming from a different region of the United States. So I'm excited to share this with you. So this is my dissertation research that I worked on as a PhD candidate in Wisconsin. And what I'm going to be talking about is, stone tools, certainly, but specifically the kind of information that we can get from them and how we can use that to better understand the people that were living during the time period that I study. So, a lot of people, when they look at stone tools, they look at, what type of tool is it? Is it a point? What kind of point? That'll tell you how old it is. But oftentimes the research doesn't really go much further than that. And that's been a particular problem in the time period and the geographic area that I study, because the stone tools are notoriously not very pretty and not very complex. And so people oftentimes don't ask more complex questions of them and really focus on material culture like pottery to ask questions about what people's daily lives were like, what their community was like, how they communicated and related to other people. So, what I wanted to do was see what stone tools can contribute to those kind of questions. So the archaeological culture that I study is called Oneota. And this is, you can see, this is a wide-ranging phenomenon. So it's not limited to the areas on this map. Oneota sites are found as far west as Nebraska, up into Canada, as far south as Missouri, and as far east as Michigan. So it's a wide-ranging phenomenon. And it's mostly defined by the pottery. And so Oneota is different from the late woodland, which precedes it. So Oneota is a late prehistoric phenomenon, goes from about 1000 AD to just pre-contact, 1650 in Wisconsin. Those are the dates. And it's defined mostly by globular shell-tempered pots. So prior to that, you have grit-tempered pots, and Oneota is where we see the switch to shell temper. So I always was frustrated by kind of this very broad definition of what it means to be Oneota, and that's why we end up with this gigantic cultural area, and we don't really know how the people within this archaeological culture, as archaeologists have defined it, understood themselves and their relationships to each other. Their lithics are unremarkable, as you can see pictured here, although since coming to the East Coast, I have come to appreciate them more than I once did. So the lithics at Oneota sites are just characterized by triangular points and thumbnail scrapers. Those are kind of the two big categories that people think of when they're defining an Oneota site. They're not very different, though, than what you see during the late woodland period. So, and they're not very different from what you see of other archaeological cultures that existed in different geographic areas at the same time. Pretty similar technology there. So we've got a very broad definition of what it means to be Oneota. And so for my dissertation research, I wanted to narrow that down a little bit. So come up with an idea of what makes Oneota stone tools. Is there anything that makes them different than other contemporaneous cultures? And are there differences between what we call localities? And so you'll notice here on this map that we've got these green areas are what we call localities. They're these discrete places that we find Oneota sites, and there are almost no Oneota sites outside of these localities. So you have these really large, what we call no man's lands between the localities where you just don't have people living at that time, at least people that shared this material culture signature. So I wanted to look at two different localities and see if there are differences not only in the way they're using their stone materials, but also in their community, how they organize themselves and related to each other. So the two areas that I looked at were the Koshkonong locality here in southeastern Wisconsin, and then the La Crosse locality in southwestern Wisconsin along the Mississippi River. And I'll have some more detailed maps of these along the way here. So one of the things that I thought was important at the beginning of this research was to define, what do I mean by community? So this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and it has meant a lot of different things in archaeology, not to mention other fields. So I wanted to come up with a specific definition of what community means in my research, because it can mean a lot of things. So I have this illustration on here. This is from a publication by Jody O'Gorman, who's at Michigan State University, who also did some work on Oneota community. And you can see that she's got a lot of different types of community that you might see a person falling into, right? So there's their marital community, which is the family that you marry into. There's your natal community, which is your family that you were born into. There's your longhouse community. So in many areas, Oneota peoples lived in longhouses. And so you would have multiple families in the same longhouse. So that's another kind of community. And then there's the village community beyond that longhouse. So if you use community for all of those things, that is what are you even talking about at that point? So I think that while all of these levels of relating to each other exist, certainly, we're closer to our immediate family than we are to our extended family, than we are to our neighbors, than we are to the people in the next town over, right? Those are all different levels of relationships. But I found it to be a little too confusing to call them all community, because then you're just kind of stacking things a little too much. So what I wanted to say is that you've got this social institution reflecting shared ideals that is enacted through regular face-to-face human interaction. And that's the face-to-face part differs from what a lot of people in archaeology refer to as community. I'm fine with using the term community in other ways, but I think that it can get confusing, and I wanted to be specific about what I mean by it. And so there are other ways that people relate to each other beyond these kind of face-to-face communities, but the face-to-face community is what I was interested in understanding in my research. Okay. So looking at these two localities, the map on the left here is the La Crosse locality, and the map on the right is the Kashkonong locality. I should mention that these maps are at different scales, so it's not that the Kashkonong sites are giant, quite the opposite. This is at 1 to 32,000, and this is 1 to 100,000. I did that because the La Crosse sites that I looked at are further apart from one another, so it was harder to get them all in the same area. So I looked at 4 sites from the Kashkonong locality and 5 sites from the La Crosse locality. 3 of the sites in La Crosse were probably all one site, just they happened to be split by archaeologists when they were excavating them. So I suspect that Tremaine, OT, and Filler grouped up here at the top end of the map right there are all part of one site. And then you have 2 other sites further to the south here, State Road Coulee and Pamel Creek. All of these sites were excavated as part of CRM mitigation excavations. So that has severely limited the information that comes from the southern 2 sites. The northern 3 were much more heavily, more thoroughly excavated. The sites in Kashkonong were all excavated primarily by field schools. So you've got a different level of documentation. And the site specifically that I did most of my field work at is the Crescent Bay Hunt Club site. But I contextualize it with information from these 4 other sites. So this is the area that I'm looking at. This is the data that I collected from these sites. So the Kashkonong locality, here you've got radiocarbon dates. You'll notice that these 4 Kashkonong sites are on the early end of things. They're mostly between 1000 and 1400 AD, whereas the La Crosse sites are a little bit later. They're mostly between 1400 and 1650. Okay, so we're not just looking at geographic differences here, we're also looking at temporal differences. So keep that in mind. That plays a role in these community differences that we see as well. You will also see that there's a lot more lithics coming from La Crosse than Kashkonong. Some of that has to do with the size of the sites that were excavated, and we'll talk about that more. But there's some other factors, I think, that play into that as well. So this is the number of tools that I looked at from each of these sites and the amount of debitage that I looked at from each of these sites. So the variables that I looked at, just to kind of give you an overview of the methods that I was using to get this information. Of course, I was interested in the raw materials that people were using. In Wisconsin, people are using almost exclusively chert because there is chert readily available in most areas. In fact, there's a lot of different varieties of chert that are available. And so we're able to identify where outcrops are, how far away they are from these sites, and how much time and energy people were expending to go and get their raw materials. So that was something I was really interested in. I was also interested in the production methods, how people were making their tools. And you can get at that by recording variables like what was the amount of Cortex still found on the outside of tools. So were they doing all of their primary reduction, their primary reduction from cores at the village sites, or were they doing it somewhere else? And you can tell that based on the amount of Cortex on the debitage. If there's a lot of Cortex, then they're taking pieces off of the outside of the core, and that means they were doing primary reduction there. If there's not a lot of Cortex, then that means that they were doing the primary reduction somewhere else, probably their quarry, and then bringing blanks back to the site. So that was interesting. Heat treatment, were they heat treating their materials? And remember, I'm looking at do they do these things or not, and do they do them differently in La Crosse versus Kashkonong? So were they heat treating their materials, which in case you don't know, if you have relatively poor quality raw materials, in many cases you can make them more amenable to napping by heat treating them. You bury them in a pit underneath a little bit of sand, you light a really hot fire over top of them, and then that causes the material to kind of resort its chemical structure in a way that makes it easier to nap. There are some outside signs of heat treatment like luster and reddish color that make it possible to identify. And then method of modification was a big one, I think, that people often don't think about. If you know about flint knapping, you're always thinking of flaking as a method of modification. I would also add to that battering, because you find a lot of smashed things. People just kind of crush the edges and use that to modify it. And that indicates the amount of time and energy expenditure that people have for these things. Were they taking the time and energy to nicely flake the edges, or were they just crushing them into the shape that they wanted and moving on? So method of modification, or even more expedient, did they just not modify it at all? They grabbed a flake and said, I'll just use this as is. I don't even need to modify the edge at all. So these production methods for me are all about getting at how much time and energy did they put into making their tools. And then, of course, I looked at tool forms. So for me, yes, I'm interested in what I call morpho-functional tool types. So morpho-functional tools is exactly what the term sounds like. It's morphology. So the shape of the tool means the function. Morpho-functional type means it's a type assigned because you think the form of the tool equals the function of the tool. So for instance, calling something an arrow point because it's triangular, or calling something a scraper because it's got a steep edge, or calling something a drill because it's T-shaped and has a skinny point, right? So those are morpho-functional types. The very name implies what it was used for. So yes, I wanted to use those terms, but because I think that form and function don't always line up 100% of the time, I also define tool function by, tool form by, is it a biface? So are both sides of it flaked? Is it a multiface, which means a core in most cases, it has more than two faces? Is it a uniface? They only flaked one side of it and left the other, or is it what I call edge only? So an edge only is basically only the edge of the tool was flaked. And in my collections that I was looking at, just because something is an arrow point doesn't mean that it's a biface. A lot of these little triangular arrow points, all they did was take a few little flakes off of the edges, and that was it. They weren't taking flakes the whole way across the body of the tool and spending time shaping it. All they did was they took a roughly triangular flake and knocked some pieces off of the edges. So that's an edge only. Or if you have a flake that somebody just picked up and said, I'm going to use this to cut something right now without modifying it all, and the only way you can tell it was a tool is because there's some use damage on it, that's an edge only. Okay, so tool forms. And then lastly, tool function. So how do I get at tool function? That's the next question. There's two ways. One is by doing Useware analysis. So this is kind of my technological specialty, where you look at different, you look at tools underneath a microscope and you look for traces of what they were used for. So if you took a pair of scissors and you used it to cut a pen, right? You were sawing on this pen with it, that plastic is going to leave a different trace than if you were just cutting a piece of paper, right? Because the plastic is a lot harder than the paper. So you would have different wear on the tool that you're using, right? So for instance, if I was using a flake to cut wood, I would expect to see a lot more damage to it than if I was using it to cut meat, right? Because meat is much softer. So the damage is kind of macroscopic, or damage you can see in terms of flaking or rounding. So rounding you see more often if you're using it on a soft material, it wears down. Whereas if you're using it on a hard material, you have flakes that come off because you're breaking the edge of the tool on this hard material, right? Just like your knife would dull faster if you used it to cut wood as opposed to, again, cutting a softer material. The other type of useware that you can see is polish. So if you want to get more specific than soft versus hard material, you look at polishes. And you can do that. You have to use about 50 to 200 times magnification. So polishes develop differently for different contact materials. And the only way that you can know what a polish looks like for a particular contact material is to do experiments. So prior to doing my archaeological analysis, I did a really large experimental scheme where I took over 100 flake tools and used them to disarticulate deer limbs, to cut meat, to scrape wet hide, to scrape dry hide, to shuck corn, to cut reeds, to saw wood, to carve antler, right? So all of these different contact materials, and to do it for different periods of time too, because again, your knife is going to dull more over a larger period of time. So then I could look under my microscope and say, okay, this is what a tool used on meat for 45 minutes looks like. And then I look at an archaeological tool and say, huh, that looks a lot like a tool that was used on meat for 45 minutes. Maybe that's what it was used for. And to be scientific about it, we went through with the experimental tools after I had made all of them, and I did a blind test to see how frequently I could identify the useware correctly. And it was about 85% of the time I could identify the contact material that had been used on. So that's not bad, but it's not 100% of the time, right? And just like anything in archaeology, there's a lot of variables that play into this. So useware is not a panacea. It doesn't tell us everything, but it does give us a lot more information than just saying it was triangular, they must have shot something with it, right? So at least I can say something a little more direct about it. So that's one end of it. And then the other end is blood residue analysis. So you can get information about what specific species a tool might have come in contact with using blood residue analysis. So the way this works is you take a tool, you have no idea if it was used or not. I use my useware analysis to say, I think these tools are good candidates for blood residue analysis. And then you go and you lift residues from it using a solution. So they're liquid, and you'll be surprised at how long these residues will stay in place. If you've looked at stone tools, there's a lot of little cracks in there that it's easy for blood to get into. So I had no problem finding blood residues on 8 out of 41 tools that I tested. So all of these tools tested positive for blood residue. You have to choose what species you want to test for. So for instance, I can't just say, I want to test it for everything, because the way it works is it's an antibody reaction. So you test a particular tool against a specific antibody, say the antibody for dog. And if there is a reaction, then yes, it was dog. That's right, it reacts with it. If there's not a reaction, there could be blood on there from something else, but you only tested it against dog. So that's the only one you know about. So each of these tools was tested against 6 species. And I came up with, there were 3 that tested positive for deer, 2 that tested positive for bison, 1 for dog, and 2 for human. So I have consistently run into problems every time I suggest that the human blood residues might be suggestive of violence, because someone's like, have you ever flint napped? You bleed all the time, which is true. I am notoriously covered in Band-Aids when I'm flint napping, but I don't think that that's the only explanation for what's going on here. And I'll talk about some of the other evidence we have for violence at Oneota sites. Okay, so these are the methods that I'm using to get this information. So using that information, I compared the two different localities. So those, looking at, these are all the variables: the raw material quality, is it good, is it poor, the amount of cortex, is it heat treated, the basic tool form, that was the biface, multiface, uniface, method of modification, is it flaked, battered, Useware only, is it complete or broken, and was it hafted or not? So is there any evidence of hafting? And all of your very low p-values tell you that yes, this is significant, except for broken. So there were just as many broken tools in La Crosse as there were in Kashkonong. Everybody's breaking their tools. But everything else between the two localities is different. So people are making and using their tools differently in Western Wisconsin than they are in Eastern Wisconsin. So what are the differences then? We can tell if we look at correspondence analysis was another really helpful way for me to visualize not only the differences between the localities, but if there are differences within the localities. So what you have here is a biplot which shows raw materials in red. Okay, so the red dots are different chert types that people were using. The green triangles are the Kashkonong sites, and the blue circles are the La Crosse sites. And what you notice is all of the Kashkonong sites gather really neatly together, and the La Crosse sites are spread out. So what that indicates is that there's more variation in what's going on in La Crosse than there is in Kashkonong. Everybody in Kashkonong is doing the same thing. They're all using the same kind of raw materials, whereas in La Crosse, they're using a bunch of different stuff from each other. You see the same kind of thing when you look at the contact materials for the Useware. So again, here, the red dots are the contact materials. So were they using tools on dry hide, meat, wood, bone? And the blue dots are La Crosse. The green triangles are Kashkonong. Again, the two so I only did Useware on 2 of the sites. I did not do Useware on all 5,000 tools. I would be dead and blind. But I did do a sample of 800 tools that I looked at from, yes, that's right, Bill. So it took a long time, and I wear glasses now. But that did give me a good idea of what was going on in La Crosse. And so I looked at 2 sites from La Crosse, one from the northern end, one from the southern end, the ones that I had the most complete data for, and 2 sites again from Kashkonong that I had the most data from to give me an idea of what was going on there. And again, the results show here different things going on from each other in La Crosse, same things going on at Kashkonong. If you look at the breakdown of these 4 sites, so these 2 on the right are the Kashkonong sites, the 2 on the left are the La Crosse sites. These are the raw materials that things were used on. You'll notice I have soft and hard here. So remember when I was talking about soft materials show up differently than hard materials, they produce different wear. Sometimes I can't get specific enough to say this was used on plant or this was used on meat. But I can say, I know it was a soft material of some kind because polish takes a while to accrue. So if I only use something for 5 minutes, it's going to have what I call generic weak polish on it. So it's this kind of intermediate level of polish where I can tell you, well, it's definitely a soft material of some kind, but I can't get more specific than that. So that's what I mean by those 2 categories. If you look at Pamel Creek, which is a La Crosse site, in comparison to Tremaine, the other La Crosse site, they don't look that much alike. In fact, they look suspiciously more similar to the Kashkonong sites. So Pamel Creek is weird, and I'll talk a little more about why as we go on here, because it doesn't fit with the general pattern of what's going on in La Crosse. And again, this just supports the idea that things at La Crosse sites are more heterogeneous. They're not all the same. Things at Kashkonong sites are more homogeneous. So, okay, this is all about the rocks, right? What did, this is what the rocks say. Now, what can we do? What can we say about community? What can we say about people, the actual people here? What people were doing, how people were relating to each other based on these rocks. And not just the rocks, right? You're going to have to look at some other data as well, looking at settlement patterns and types of structures, burials, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to bring some more data in here to support what the rocks are saying. So there's, I think, three big differences that we see between the two localities. One is the population density and size, and I'll talk about each of these in turn on slides that are coming up here. One is the prevalence of violence. I think there's more violence in one locality than the other. And the other is greater social differentiation in one locality than the other. So if you look at, this is sites in La Crosse on the left. Again, these are at different scales, and sites in Kashkonong. These are 2-kilometer buffers around each of the sites is what those yellow circles are. And these aren't just the sites that I used in my dissertation. These are all of the Oneota sites that have been recorded in each locality. What you'll notice is that in Kashkonong, all of them overlap. Lake Kashkonong, which you can see down here on the bottom, is a very large lake. There's plenty of room for people to put sites the whole way around the lake, but instead they gathered all right here on the northern side, all within 2 kilometers of each other. In fact, much less in most cases, and on bluff tops around the lake edges, highly defensible positions. Whereas if you look at La Crosse, you have sites that are spaced further apart from each other. Again, a little overlap here, but I suspect that's because those are actually all one site and not multiple sites. They're just excavated separately. So that's why you see multiple circles there. Same thing down here. Overhead and Pamel Creek are also probably both the same site. Okay, so much less overlap going on. You've got a much larger population in La Crosse, but they're much more spread out too. So I think that relates to two different things. One is population size. So this is a map of the longhouses at Tremaine. Longhouses at Tremaine were upwards of 50 meters long. So we're talking relatively large structures here that you could have had a couple dozen people easily living in these. And if you look at Crescent Bay Hunt Club, which is from the Kashkonong locality, you've got a very different living pattern here. So we have two different types of structures at Crescent Bay. We have wigwams, which are these purple ones here. And then there are long structures. I hesitate to call them long houses because there's not very good evidence for them being used as houses. The lithic and the floral material from these suggests that they were not residential. There's not much wood charcoal. We know that this site was occupied year round, so there's not a lot of evidence that they were burning fires in these regularly. Additionally, there's a lot more lithic debitage in the longhouses, but not much in the way of used tools. So the tools that were used are used mostly on hard substances like wood or bone. So what I think is going on in the long structures at Crescent Bay is that they are more of a communal structure where men or women might have gathered to flint knap and participate in community rituals. They weren't lodging. Whereas the wigwams, we see that's where all the butchery is happening and not much flint knapping, because you wouldn't want a bunch of debitage on your house floor, right? So that makes sense. You wouldn't want to step all over that. So Look at the size difference, though, of Crescent Bay versus Tremaine, right? So you have these little single-family houses. You have 3 of them at Crescent Bay, and then you have 8 longhouses that could accommodate several dozen people at Tremaine. So Tremaine, one longhouse could easily house the entire population of Crescent Bay. So much higher population density at La Crosse, and just higher population size in general. The other thing that goes along with that, if we go back to this real quick, is defensibility. So the Koshkonong sites are built in very defensible locations. As I mentioned, they're up on these bluff tops, and they're all within very close connection of one another. So you could easily access each of these sites from the land, but only from each other, right? So they're all very close to one another. So that suggests to me that if they were fighting people, they weren't fighting each other because they were all very close together. Whereas in La Crosse, people might not have gotten along quite as well. So I think that this says something about community, because I think that the community in Koshkonong was a multi-site, multi-village community. You were just as close to the people in Koshkonong Creek Village as you were to the people who lived in your own village in Crescent Bay Hunt Club. And you can see that based on the lithic material, right? People at Koshkonong Creek Village are doing the exact same thing as the people at Crescent Bay Hunt Club. And you can interpret that one of 2 ways. They're the same people that are just moving from one site to another, because we're talking a multiple year period of occupation here. They could have certainly occupied one site and then moved on to the next. Or you have people occupying these sites contemporaneously, and they are just in very close communication with one another. They're just as tightly knit as if they were part of the same village. You don't see that in La Crosse, right? People are doing different things at different villages. The villages are farther apart, and they're just not communicating as much. And then the last thing that I mentioned is social differentiation. So burials at the Tremaine site are primarily in longhouses. They're almost entirely located as formal burials under the longhouse floor. You see more grave goods in them than you see at Koshkonong sites. So, and there's also one specific, which you don't see on this map, burial area where most of the grave goods are, that's separate from all of the longhouses. So that suggests to me that you have differences in social status, the people who are buried away from the longhouse versus the people who are buried in the longhouses. In Koshkonong, people are buried every way that you can possibly imagine. So we have isolated human remains that are found in trash pits. Even the formal burials are repurposed as trash pits. So a woman who we excavated in 2017, she was buried in a very formal burial pit with 2 pipe bowls. So very respectfully buried, but then they filled in over top of her with some soil and then used the rest of the depression as a trash pit. So there's definitely repurposing here, although the trash worked really nicely as a fill-in for the burial as well. But you do see some burials, you'll notice here, in these long structures. So these walls here are the structures, and you do see some burials in there like you do at La Crosse, but it's definitely not as formally structured. There's just a large amount of variation. In fact, the only thing that you do see variation in at Koshkonong is the burials. There's a lot of intra-site variation in what they're doing there. All right, so what's the breakdown then of these community differences, just to kind of get it all in one place? In La Crosse, we see more variation in lithic technology. People are making things in a lot of different ways, and they're using them in a lot of different ways. Whereas in Koshkonong, everybody makes things the same and uses it the same way. In La Crosse, there's more evidence for social differentiation, whereas in Kashkenong, there's less social differentiation. Not altogether surprising, since they're much smaller population at Kashkenong. Less evidence for violence in La Crosse, and that comes from the skeletal remains too. Endemic violence is highly supported by the skeletal remains from Kashkenong locality sites. About 50% of the human remains that we've recovered indicate a violent death. So that's not probably representative of the general population, just of the people that we found, but it does indicate that violence was definitely a part of everyday life. And I suspect that that plays into how they lived their life in general, right? So they were using more local raw materials, for instance. People weren't going far away from the villages to get their lithic raw materials. They were staying close to the village. There's also not evidence for them really trading with other localities, which you do see in the La Crosse locality. So Kashkenong was really hunkered down. And I think that that's due to violence in the area. Larger villages in La Crosse, smaller in Kashkenong, larger catchments in La Crosse. So again, people are getting their resources from further away in La Crosse, whereas Kashkenong, let's just keep it as close as we can. Even if it's crappy raw materials, we'll use what we've got. And then in La Crosse, you see lots of extraction camps where people are going a few days away from their village, camping out there for a while, hunting there, going and getting raw materials for stone tool production. In Kashkenong, there are very few extraction camps. People were not going far. They were going out and coming back the same day, which again is suggestive of violence. People didn't want to be gone from the safety of the village for long. So that was one of my goals, right? What are the differences between the two localities? Clearly, there's some differences in what people's lives were like, right? The other goal was, is there anything we can do to characterize Oneota lithic materials in general, right? What kind of traditions characterize these people and what they were doing with stone tools? So there's not a lot that we can say, but these are the four things that I can confidently say apply to both localities, all of the lithics that I looked at. People were using local raw materials. They weren't going very far away. Even at Pamel Creek, where they had about 20% of their raw materials were Burlington chert, which came from a couple hundred miles away, everything else was local. And at the other sites, upwards of 90% of the materials were local. So when I say local, I mean within 20 kilometers of the site. So local raw material is definitely something people were doing. Using what I call expedient tool technology. Here's a selection of tools for you. Here's some edge-only tools. And you can see flakes coming off from the edges there. Some of these were intentionally flaked. Some of these flakes are just from use. Those are expedient tools. You grab a flake, you use it, you throw it away when it's done. The opposite of an expedient tool technology, of course, would be a curated tool, where you make a really nice Clovis point. You're going to use that thing for a long time before you throw it away, right? So it's just a different way of investing your time and energy. Instead of using one thing for a really long time as a multi-purpose tool, you're going to use a bunch of little crappy things and throw them away when you're done with them. Economization in production. So people were really economizing the raw materials that they were using at all of these sites. So the debitage to tool ratio is one way that you can look at this. And particularly at Kashkenong, the debitage to tool ratio was less than 10 to 1 at all of those sites. So that means 10 flakes for every one tool that you found. That's definitely not enough to account for all of those tools, right? They must have been napping somewhere else. But also, it's highly suggestive that people were trying to conserve their raw materials, and the expedient tools that they're making are just one way of conserving those raw materials. I'm just going to use this flake rather than waste a bunch of raw material, knocking other flakes off of it to try to make it a more formal tool. So people were using what they had and not trying to use it to the best of their ability, to the highest efficiency. And then this emphasis on purely utilitarian tools. I have not shown you a pretty tool yet, right? We do not have something here that really is used for more than a utilitarian purpose. Earlier on, we see people using stone tools maybe as a way of communicating their social status, saying, hey, I'm a really good flint knapper. Look at this cool stuff I can make. By this point, people are finding other ways to communicate their social status. Stone tools are just that, they're just tools. The one that I found, the dog tool that we used, it was used on a dog, it had dog blood residue on it, was found within 2 meters of a formal dog burial where the dog was butchered. And we suspect, although we can't say for certain, that that tool was used to butcher that dog, which was probably a ceremonial burial. The tool was not even a biface. It was just a flake tool that was used. So just because people are using these things for ceremonial purposes, that didn't imbue them with some kind of special significance. They were just tools to them at this point in prehistory. There's one other thing that kind of came to me towards the end of my research, and this has been discussed a little bit before, but it's been the focus of my research since I finished my dissertation, is looking at the possibility that the reason people switch from a curated tool technology earlier in prehistory to an expedient tool technology later in prehistory is because it's different people who are making the tools. So there's a lot of ethnographic evidence that women made and used stone tools, but the vast majority of tools that they made and used were flake tools. And flake tools often get ignored in the archaeological record because, one, it's hard to tell if a flake was used or not. And two, I think Lou Binford once said, there are so many of them that they just obscure everything else and you can't tell what they were used for, so it's best to just ignore them. Well, that's where my Useware came in. I really wanted to know what these flake tools were being used for, because at Crescent Bay, flake tools account for 50% of the assemblage. So your arrow points, your scrapers, everything you could identify based on its form, that's only 50%. So you only know what half of the people are doing, what half of their tools are being used for if you ignore the flake tools. So when we start to see these more expedient tools being used in late prehistory, I think it's because it's not only because of women making the tools, but I think that it plays a part in why we see the change in the technology. Because men have other ways now that they're signaling their social status, primarily in warfare, which is increasing as the population increases at this time period. So warfare and hunting stick around as ways for men to signal their social status, but stone tools, particularly as raw materials get harder to come by without getting killed when you go out to get them, people aren't spending as much time on making stone tools. And so I don't think that the men are the ones who are producing most of the stone tools. Also, keep in mind that women are doing almost all of the labor around the camp, around the village. Men spend most of their time away from the village, hunting, engaging in raiding. So the village is really women's domestic sphere where they're spending most of their time. So you would expect that most of the tools that are being produced and used there are being produced and used by them. It's not like I'm going to wait around every time I need a flake to scrape a hide and say, honey, can you make me a flake when you get home today? You're going to make and use what you need in that moment. So I think that one of the explanations for why We see a change in the lithic technology at this time period from formal curated tools to expedient utilitarian tools, is that men just aren't making as many of them. And if they are making them, they're not making them at the villages. And as archaeologists, we excavate mostly villages because that's where most of the stuff is. We don't easily find small ephemeral hunting camps where men would have been doing the majority of the labor. So I think that this plays an important role in understanding, getting at the community and what people's daily lives were like and what stone tools can tell us about them. So that's most of what I have to say. I have a lot of people to thank. In addition to all of you for having me here, I really appreciate it, especially Bill for hooking me on this one, and all of the members of my dissertation committee and cohort who helped me with this, as well as the the facilities that housed all of the artifacts that I used for this research. So thanks to all of them. And thank you to you guys.
Thank you, Kat. Really appreciate it. That was a wonderful talk.
Thanks.
I do have a couple questions. I'm going to keep everybody muted for now. I'll unmute people in a minute here. I have a couple questions people posted in the chat. And if you do have more questions, you can post them in the chat. I'll read through them. And once we work through those, then we'll open it up for some discussion. I have to scroll up to find the earliest one. There's only a few questions in here. There was a question from, actually a statement and a question from Chris and Monica Warwick. Chris is actually from Berrien County, Michigan, and he was excited because, this is in the
area,
Oneota, right? Yeah. And so he said he grew up in the area. He hunted for arrowheads as a kid, and he wanted to know, is the majority of the type of stone used flint or chert, or is there something else as well?
The majority of it is chert. There is some very little quartz and quartzite. Now, if you go to Western Wisconsin, silicified sandstone, specifically Hickston silicified sandstone, you do see a lot of that there. But in Eastern Wisconsin, it's pretty much all chert, a little bit of rhyolite, but almost all chert. And even in Western Wisconsin, I would say Tremaine has maybe 20% silicified sandstone and the rest is chert.
Thank you. Another question was, what were the blood residues that you tested?
Oh, so I did it in a couple different batches, and so I think we might have changed blood residues at one, or Sarah, that we tested against, but we did rabbit, deer, dog, human, bison, something else.
Pop quiz. Pop quiz.
So long ago. There was one other one. Goat. So that's always a weird one because people are like, why goat? Goat reacts with both cervids and bovids, so it'd react with both deer and bison. So if you kind of skipped, if it didn't react with deer or bison specifically, goat might catch one of those. And one of our positives actually was for the goat. So, but I always say deer because I don't want to explain what I just explained in the middle of my talk. But that's why we did goat.
Sure. Another question, did people migrate from east to west?
I think so, but that's controversial. So I think that is a lot of the early dates in Eastern Wisconsin are still hotly contested, particularly by the Western Wisconsin folks. But there's certainly evidence that the folks in Eastern Wisconsin were there first. And there's a lot of debate over Oneota origins. Did these people that migrated in, or did they live there already as late woodland folks, and then their culture changed? Nobody is very committed, very sure of any of these. I certainly fall into the in situ camp where I think they were there before, and they changed what they were doing based on ideas that were coming up from the South Probably not Cahokia itself, because some of these Oneota sites are very early. You know, we're talking AD 1000, maybe earlier in some of the cases. But I definitely think that people were there before. But we don't, you know, and there are contemporaneous late woodland sites and even Mississippian sites in the area. And they were not trading, they were not hanging out, they did not, there was nothing going on there. So I'm not sure where they came from or where they went, but the La Crosse sites, it's interesting, are much closer to the Iowa Oneota, which we know for sure is historically connected to the Iowa, the historic Native American tribe. So I think you do see some continuity there. It seems a little more like the Eastern Oneota just kind of disappeared and didn't move anywhere. So I'm not sure where the Western folks came from, but they were doing something very different from the Eastern folks. So some of them might have come from Eastern Wisconsin. A lot of people think that they might have actually come from Minnesota. So, because we have some earlier sites in Minnesota too.
Thank you. Another person asked, when you mentioned the amount of cortex as a lithic variable, what do you mean by cortex exactly?
Yeah, so if you, chert comes in a couple different types of packages. So you can get it in nodules, these big round. My husband usually has a lot of it laying around, but I don't have any at hand, actually, rarely. But it comes in these big round packages if it's a nodule, or it can be tabular. And if you've seen chert, you know it's usually very smooth and fine-grained, and the cortex is the outer shell of it. So when you find a piece of chert, if it's a nodule, it just looks like a limestone boulder. So the cortex is usually limestone. It's bedded in limestone. And if you strike it and knock a flake off, then you'll actually see the chert inside that limestone cortex. So that's what I mean by cortex. When you initially get your big round boulder of it, you're going to have to take a bunch of flakes off of the outside to remove that cortex, because that limestone doesn't break very nicely like chert does. It doesn't have that conchoidal fracture. But once you get into the chert, then that's what you're going to want to use to make your tools out of. But so if you're doing early stage reduction, that just means I have the actual nodule. I picked it up at the quarry where I initially found it, and I'm going to knock pieces off of it until it's what we would call a blank. So now I've got a piece that I can actually work with and make tools out of, because the cortex is useless to you.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you, and you already sort of touched on this question. It's not a softball question. I was going to ask you, who are the Oneota? Where in the world do they come from? And I don't want to like throw you under the bus on this question, because I know that's a very heated. I know the background of the research in the area, you know, but yeah, what's your opinion?
But you feel like torturing me in front of strangers.
Sorry.
So yeah, this is, as I said, it's a hotly contested issue. And I'm of the in situ camp. But I think, and this is why I have a problem with calling them the Oneota, or even calling Oneota as a cultural unit, because I think there is so much variation between different localities of Oneota that I don't think it's a good cultural unit. I don't think it is a good way of defining what people are doing. So, you know, when we go back to my slide on Oneolithic traditions, none of these four things that I list are any different from what other archaeological cultures are doing at the same time period. People are doing the same things. The pottery at Oneota sites is, yes, different from Mississippian, different from Fort Ancient, but there's so much variation between localities as well that you see almost as much variation within Oneota as you do across these categories. So I think the term Oneota has, I'm very iconoclastic about that in general. I don't think that it's a particularly useful term. You know, one of the things that appealed to me about this community approach is the idea of a, an approach that looks at these face-to-face communities right now, but these Oneota traditions, the things that all of the localities have in common, I think those are indicative of long past communities. So the traditions, the things that stick around, are the things that, people have in common from long ago, when they were all part of a face-to-face community, and then individuals split off and went different ways and took some of these ideas with them. I don't think that they migrated in. I do think that you have Mississippian influence on these people, but I don't think that it's in any kind of person-to-person way. I think ideas are just getting passed down the line from, the southern parts of Illinois up through northeastern Illinois, where you see fisher culture and that sort of thing. But does that help?
I think you're right. I think it's a local response. It's
yes.
a local response to that influx from other cultures coming up north. Another archaeologist, I'm pretty sure you know who this person is. I'm not going to name them here, but they one time told me that Oneota were a bunch of Illinois tourists that came up to Wisconsin and overstayed their welcome. And I thought, no, that's not it.
It's just trying to get you because of the Illinois thing.
I didn't know that I was from Illinois. They did not know.
Okay. Because I would have said that to you too.
Oh, I know you would have. That's fine, So, it's just, it's funny how, we don't know who they are. And I like how you bring up the point that there's so much variation among their communities, and to just lump them together as calling them Oneota because they all make pottery that is shell tempered is kind of juvenile,
It was a useful, I think, this is a term that has been around since the 40s. And, it was a useful category then, but I think it has become increasingly less useful because of, the more you know.
Sure. We have one more question, and then Jack has his hand up. We'll get to you, Jack, and then we're going to unmute everybody so we can have a bit of a discussion. Another person wrote, what made you choose the Oneota to research?
My advisor. So I did some work in Ohio with Fort Ancient, which is a late prehistoric group. And I was interested in lithics. So I knew that I wanted to work on late prehistoric groups, and I wanted to work on lithics. And so when I was looking at graduate schools, I specifically picked UWM because I wanted to work with Bob Jeske there, who works on late prehistoric lithics. And when he's like, well, nobody's looked at any of the lithics from my site. So I was like, well done. All right, that was simple. So a lot of people go through some pretty agonizing permutations trying to figure out what they want to do their dissertation on. I was not picky.
Sure. Jack, do you have a question? Go ahead.
Actually, I had two. One of them was, you have spent your life working on lithics. How did you get started with lithics? A lot of archaeologists are, well, they're either lithics people or ceramics people, and I have been one of the ceramics people for most of my life. How did you get started on lithics?
I've always liked rocks. I think, I collected rocks as a kid, and I think that was something that appealed to me. I also, I think, was drawn to lithics in part because it's such a male-dominated field, and I wanted to contribute to it not being that way. I really like the variety of the materials that you get to work with. With pottery, I think a lot of, and I have since come to like pottery, although I made fun of it a lot as a graduate student, because you got the lithics people versus the pottery people. But pottery is an additive technology where you start with clay and you build it up from there, whereas lithics are a reductive technology. And I liked the variety in what you start with in lithics.
Great.
I also feel like I should address the Oneota question, Oneolithics question a little bit better too, because there is another reason that I wanted to do Oneolithics, and that's no one looks at them. And so I was really the first person to do, the only person to do a large scale analysis of them. And the reason nobody looks at them is because Oneota is a pottery culture. People identify Oneota, I already mentioned, by the pottery. The lithics aren't pretty. And they don't really differentiate, Oneota from other contemporaneous societies. So I was drawn to it because I thought there was some value there, and I thought people weren't looking at that. And so I was interested in that, because even in Fort Ancient, people are way more interested in the lithics than they are in Oneota. And so I wanted to fill a gap in the knowledge there.
Well, it definitely pays to pick something that's not an area that's not crowded. Look
yes.
for or a topic that nobody else is working on.
Mm-hmm.
The leader of the pack real quick.
Yes, I definitely became the Oneota lithics person, which is good and not that prestigious if you look at what they look like. But yeah.
My introduction to North American archaeology was on an Oneota site called the Utes site in northwestern Missouri.
Okay.
I didn't realize it was that widespread. And since I
Yeah.
spent most of my field school experience working on a part of a burial, I don't really remember much about either the lithics or the ceramics.
Yeah, the ceramics are actually quite nice. So
So I understand, but I didn't get that much fun with it.
Exposure to that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was really great to talk to you guys. Are there any more questions at all?
Someone said that they guess you could say that lithics rock.
There you go. Yes.
They sound pretty sharp.
My husband is a lithicist too, and his last name is Ulrichs, and our advisor always called him Ulrocks. So we've heard the puns. He's a big fan of dad jokes, so he didn't mind.
Oh yeah, Rob and I could go head to head. That'd be fun.
Oh yeah.
I miss being in the field with Rob. He was fun. It was very fun in the field with him. So.
He is a funny guy.
Another question came through. What is your favorite material for napping? If you nap yourself.
Ooh, Flint Ridge chert is my favorite. Rob and I have an ongoing debate about this. His favorite is Wyandotte from Southern Indiana, and my favorite is Flint Ridge. He says that I only like it because it's pretty, because it comes in really pretty colors of reds and blues, which is true, but it also naps really nicely. So that's
Where's Flint Ridge from?
Ohio. And Flint Ridge is so pretty that you see a lot of it being traded all around the country. So it's something that really makes its way around through Hopewell, the Hopewell interaction sphere mostly. But obviously the Hopewell sites are centered right there, right by Flint Ridge. So folks were getting it there pretty easily. Flint Ridge actually has a nap-in twice a year at Flint Ridge National, it's state, I think it's a state park, which I've been to once, which is, it's pretty impressive. They do it on Labor Day and Memorial Day. The guys that nap there are all way better than me. So they really make some impressive works of art.
I actually have another question for you. Can you go back a few slides and I'll tell you when to stop? I got a question. Keep going, keep going. It was where you had a map. Nope, keep going. There you go, that one. Wait. Yeah, that
Map?
one. So you said that the localities along the Mississippi River, right?
Yes.
They have a lot more variation in terms of the raw materials that they're using.
Yes.
And is that material all found right along the Mississippi, or are they getting material from further inland from in Wisconsin and in Iowa and in Minnesota? Are they bringing stuff in from further afield, or are they staying pretty much along the Mississippi for their sourcing?
It's mostly still local. So it's mostly still along the Mississippi. So, Hickston is right up in here, which is where you're getting your silicified sandstone, which explains why you see a lot more of it at the Tremaine site than you do down here at Pamela Creek or State Road Coulee. Pamela Creek is a really strange anomaly, though, in a lot of ways. It makes me both glad that I chose it as one of my sites and disappointed that I did, because I don't know that it's representative of the locality as a whole. So Pamela Creek was occupied for a fairly short period of time. So if we go back to the radiocarbon dates, Pamela Creek is 1380 to 1570, but most of the dates cluster between 1400 and 1450. So it was probably not occupied for very long. And they have a really high proportion of Burlington chert, which comes from a couple hundred miles to the south.
Yeah.
So in your question about where did they come from, I really do think that the folks at Pamela Creek migrated up from the south and brought their Burlington with them, because you don't see that much Burlington at any other Oneota site. And if you look at what they were using tools for as well, the Pamela Creek assemblage looks very different from everything else. You've got a ton of bone tools, which you don't see anywhere else, and also a lot more woodworking than you see anywhere else. And also look at this really high percentage of hard materials. That probably represents even more bone and wood being worked. So yes, it's possible that it was a special purpose location, but I also think that it has to do with people coming from a different area. So Pamela Creek's kind of weird that way, but the other ones are all pretty much local materials along the Mississippi there. It's just what's local along the Mississippi is, of course, different than what's local in eastern Wisconsin.
Sure. Any other questions? You can unmute yourself now if you have questions. You have the ability to do that.
Anybody?
Bueller? No. Well, in that case, Kat, I really appreciate the talk. I think it was an outstanding presentation with some wonderful questions that were asked, and very interesting research. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'll clap. I don't know if anybody else clapping. You can't hear it. It's the Zoom clap, right?
Hey, I can see it. That's great.
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you guys for having me. I really enjoyed it. It was great to get to give the presentation to some people that are new to the material.
Sure.
Thank you.
We're very glad you could come.
Yeah, my pleasure. Be working with Bill on some stuff in the future, so maybe I'll see you guys around.
Yeah, and actually one of I don't know if she's still in here, Mandy's in there. Mandy worked with me out at Rice Farm. Mandy, do you want to say hi?
She waved.
That's
hi.
me.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, Mandy worked with me out at Rice Farm, and she's the one who excavated one of the really nice features out there.
Okay.
Not the midden though. She was there when the midden was getting excavated, but she didn't work on the midden. So. Yeah.
I've never excavated the midden. I mean, the site that I worked on where we found the pipe, I mean, it was all middens, literally. There's just tons and tons of middens, but I don't count that one because it was all middens.
Yeah.
So.
Did you ever work at Yahara?
Oh yeah, I worked at Yahara. I excavated pits there though, and mosquitoes.
I thought that one was mainly midden. too.
There were some middens, not the season that I was there. It was mostly mosquitoes when I was there. and some pits too, but I mostly remember the mosquitoes.
I believe it. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys again, and hope to see you in the future.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, that will
Thank
conclude
you.
this
Thank
time.
you for coming.
Yep.
Thank you.
Here, if you want to hang out and chat, we can, but otherwise, I think that's the end. So there's still like 28 people hanging.
Wow.